Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of the interview series that the Center for Freedom and Justice Colorado is conducting. CFJ-Colorado is a nonprofit based out of Denver, Colorado, and our mission is to provide education about and support to the town of Beit Umar in the West Bank. My name is Jennifer. I'm the producer for tonight, and I'm a member of this group. A couple of housekeeping items. Be sure to note our website address in the banner at the bottom of your screen, as well as our contact information, and feel free to email or write us to be added to our contact lists. The interview tonight will last about 45 minutes, and then we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A. For the Q&A, you may use the chat features on either YouTube or Facebook, though we do encourage you to hold off on posting chats until the Q&A session begins. So now I would like to introduce Gary Anderson, our interviewer for tonight. Gary is a civil engineer who has specialized in water and wastewater systems. He has lived and worked in Palestine for several years, managing the design of a 50-kilometer-long water distribution system for Gaza. He first visited Beit Umar in spring of 2002 when he was working as volunteer staff for the Palestine Water Authority. In Beit Umar, he saw the intentional damage that the Israeli military had done to that community's drinking water system. In 2013, he was performing a wastewater treatment study for Hebron, drove past Beit Umar for 3 months daily, and saw that the restrictions and the impacts by the Israeli military and civilian settlers had become even worse and more severe since 2002. Mr. Anderson held conventional U.S. attitudes about Israel and Palestine until the 1982 Israeli bombing of Beirut by U.S. supplied aircraft. A long, slow process of inquiry led him by the late 1990s to come around to the realities of Israel's self-established facts on the ground. This led to his first travels to the region in 2002. He is delighted to have found CFJ, and he's delighted for the opportunity to work with this committed group. So now I will turn it over to Gary.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. As she mentioned, I was very pleased a few years ago to find out about the Center for Justice and its mission to support the village of Beit Umar. As she mentioned, I've lived in the region and I worked in Palestine for 2005, 6, 7, and I guess I won't repeat what she mentioned about having been in Beit Umar in spring of 2002. This was during Israel's so-called Operation Defensive Shield, which resulted in extensive destruction of civilian infrastructure in many West Bank Palestinian communities, notably Ramallah, Jenin, and Bethlehem. I was in Beit Umar documenting the damage the Israelis had done to the domestic water system there. Center for Justice is engaged in support of Beit Umar in a variety of areas, but this protection of children is a central concern for us. We've been told that about a third of the children abducted and detained by Israeli military from Beit Umar. Now, if the population of Beit Umar were about 1/3 of the population of Palestine, it would seem proportional. None of it's right, but it would seem proportional. However, Beit Umar is maybe 18,000 people versus something like 3.7 million. So that's 1 in 200. It's 1/2 of 1%. So how does a place with 1/2 of 1% of the population have the privilege of 33% of the children being abducted and detained? So that puts the incarceration rate of Beit Umar youth at about 67 times the average for all of Palestine. So what does that mean? I guess one of two things. Either the youth of Beit Umar are 67 times more resistant to the occupying forces, or the state of Israel sees a special value to that land, wants it make it available to the cluster of nearby illegal Israeli settlements. As Jennifer mentioned, I've driven past that place 90 or 100 times in the last decade or two, and you just see there's this ring of Israeli illegal civilian occupation of land that internationally is seen as Palestine. So I'm thinking that the special value of the land is the determinant. So our group has a special interest in how the U.S. supports Israel and how this might be conditioned to the recipient's behavior. So we're delighted to be able to bring you our guest for this evening's discussion, Mrs. Zarefah Baroud. She's well informed on this and related policy matters. So let's meet her now. So Jennifer, I'll just briefly repeat her some of her credentials. She has a master's degree in policy studies from University of Washington. She researched American aid programs there to the Israeli military. She's a digital media producer for this nonprofit organization, American Muslims for Palestine. She has published various articles in Middle East Monitor, Counterpunch, Common Dreams, Socialist Worker, and others. Her most recent article is called, appropriately enough, The Leahy Laws, Why Biden's Promise to Israel is Illegal. And it can be found on Middle East Monitor Online and Counterpunch. So, Zarefah, could you please take a moment to tell us more than these credentials show about your degree program and how did you choose this inquiry as a focus area?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking about this really important subject. I've really always prioritized Palestine in my studies because it's been a priority in my life. So even during my undergrad years where I was studying media studies, Palestine was always kind of a focus for me in regards to how Palestine is shown in the media and creating content around those issues. A subject that I became aware is often omitted from conversations in our Palestinian circles and activist circles is the topic of Palestinian prisoners, even though Israeli mass incarceration is such a significant part of the Palestinian experience and such a significant factor of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I used my master's studies as an opportunity to delve more deeply into the Israeli military court system, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which led me to my interest in the Leahy laws.
Well, okay, the Leahy laws. So you see these laws as intended to guide our policy behavior and postures. So get some history there. If you could tell us about the origins of that, maybe what was intended at the time, and the specifics of it, the chronology. I don't know. Let's assume we all know nothing and step us along a little bit. So in a few minutes, we'll have a working understanding.
For sure, yeah. So the first of what we know of the Leahy laws was established by a Vermont senator named Patrick Leahy. And this was just a year before the first 10-year aid agreement with Israel and the United States was solidified. So in 1998, an amendment was made to the Foreign Assistance Act, which restricted foreign security force units from receiving aid from the United States if they had been suspected of committing a gross human rights violation. And the Foreign Assistance Act defines a gross human rights violation as cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges and trial, causing the disappearance of persons by the abduction and clandestine detention of those persons, and other flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of person. So unfortunately, the application of the law is actually very rare. A study showed that from 2010 to 2013, out of 530,000 military and security force units that were vetted by the United States, only 2,516 units were rejected aid by the Department of State using the Leahy laws. And according to another study, from 2011 to 2015, almost 90% of all cases received approval from the Department of State, leaving an average of 0.3% of all cases, 0.3% of those cases rejected aid completely. So it's a very small amount that's rejected, regardless of the unit that the aid is going to. And I think that this can kind of be summarized in the explanation for why there is a law and why it's not being followed. Human Rights Watch once stated that the Department of State will outright violate the law if a unit is important enough for U.S. strategic objectives. So I think that kind of gives us an idea of what the Leahy laws are and how they're not being applied, how they're not being practiced.
Well, okay, so let's see if we can move down the trail a little bit here. So here at our Center for Justice, Beit Umar is our focus narrowly, and Palestine broadly. So later on in this talk, we want you to get us to the present situation on the ground, but I'd first like to ask you to give us some context. For the last century or more, writers have referred to the issue of Palestine, in quotes, with capital letters. It's problematic, has been, well, for thousands of years, but the last century or so, since the late 1800s, the dynamic is changing, the international engagement with the Brits and Americans and Europeans, different push-pull influences. Can you go back a century or so to show us how we got to where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1948, the British Mandate of Palestine ended. And on that same day, Israel was established. And what that meant logistically was that a nation was established on top of an indigenous group of people. And so what that required was something that we call the Nakba, which in Arabic translates to the catastrophe. And this refers to the mass expulsion of Palestinians by the Israeli military. During the Nakba, 750,000 Palestinians out of the total 1.9 million population at the time became refugees. And during this period, Israeli forces that at the time were being sponsored by the United States took over 78% of historic Palestine. The survivors of this catastrophe and their descendants amount to roughly 7.1 million people, and they're displaced in either camps in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or any other place in the world. For example, my family comes from a town that's kind of in modern day Tel Aviv, around that area, and then they were made refugees and expelled to the Gaza Strip, to refugee camps. And then my dad then traveled to the Seattle area. But that's a very common reality for a lot of Palestinians, regardless of where in Palestine they're from. And over the course of these 70 massacres that culminated to the Nakba, Israeli forces and Israeli settlers killed an estimated 15,000 Palestinians and destroyed an estimated 70% of all Palestinian villages. So fast forwarding a little bit into the future, from 1948 to 1967, Israel then seized the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. So this means that it was now occupying 3 times more territory than it had pre-1948, including territory that was allocated to the Palestinians by the United Nations Partition Plan. So it was complete land theft that happened with the help of the West. And this ultimately manifested into the longest military occupation in modern history. So I mentioned during that explanation that the Israeli military had been sponsored by the United States government. Since 1946 is the earliest record that I can really find for when aid began being funneled into the Zionist entity that is now Israel. But the first 10-year agreement, the first solid 10-year agreement between the US and Israel was secured in 1999. And from then on, annual, what they call memorandums of understanding, MOUs, are arranged, and these are 10-year long agreements. And almost every year, U.S. aid expenditures to Israel have increased. And none of this is economic aid. This is completely, and this is specifically military aid. And in 2016, the latest MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, was established, and the United States government pledged $38 billion in military aid to Israel. $33 billion of this is foreign military financing grants, and the remaining $5 billion is for missile defense appropriations. So that's kind of a basic overview of when they started receiving money and the money that they're getting till this day, regardless of the human rights violations that I've even just listed, and I'll list more later on, but yeah.
Well, okay, that's an a whirlwind, and thanks for the broad sweep of history. I had I was living in Ramallah in 2006 at the time of the legislative elections, which went the wrong way, as the American proponents of that election had in mind, and it resulted in a Hamas victory, which really complicated. I was designing a water distribution system for Gaza. Needless to say that, since it was an American sponsor, that complicated that kind of work, which gives me a sense, a brief bit of an experience of the Palestinian perspective, that the West and people do things to Palestine, and the Palestinians have to adjust and adapt and make do and somehow work within rules set upon them by mostly the U.S. these days. So I'm thinking, so we've got a little bit now looking at the potential applicability of these rules. Can we say, somebody, we have many people who, for a variety of reasons, are very supportive of Israel, and every nation, every people, every group has a right to live in safety, and so supporting one country or another is nothing wrong with that. But people will say, why focus on Israel when there are nearly 200 other nations on the planet? I know you're better informed than I, and you've kind of talked about that, but I think we've provided Israel something like 100 billion or so of funds and war material. I think you can tune that number up a little bit, but whatever it is, it's a very big number. And if we look at our nation here at home, look at multiple domestic concerns that are underfunded with education, health care, infrastructure, whatever, it's not out of order for Americans it is to wonder why we're sending this much money to a nation whose behavior does not seem to match up with the Leahy criteria. You've given us an overview of these Leahy-related laws, but I want to just trot out the four main criteria you had, because I think there's a way you have a plan to expand upon this. Cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges and trial, disappearance and clandestine detention of these persons, denial of right to life, liberty, security. So I think this is the point where it might be good for you to develop the four cases of these conditions and see if it looks like you can make a case that one or more or all of them should or would be normally applicable. Is that going to work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my master's thesis, I basically broke up this definition of a gross human rights violation into 4 parts. So my first section is focusing on cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment. And I used Israel's Operation Protective Edge as my case for fulfilling this definition. When I was looking into this case, particularly, I was reading this one story that I'll tell to you now, that really, I think, summarizes the Israeli military's attitudes towards the Palestinian people and the lack of humanity that they exemplify. So it was around noon in Gaza, and an Israeli military aircraft fired a warning missile at the roof of Saeed's house, this man Saeed. This missile basically signals to the people in the house that the house will be bombed within 5 minutes following that warning. Saeed gathered his relatives and the children and attempted to flee the home, but 5 minutes wasn't enough time for them to get out. And 4 Israeli missiles then hit Saeed's home, killing Amal, who was 7 months pregnant, Nermeen, their 1-year-old daughter, and the unborn child. Their bodies were then discovered by their family beneath 2 walls that the force of the blast had knocked over, and the explosion left Amal's husband and their 3-year-old son wounded. So completely devastating an entire family within 5 minutes. Israel's Operation Protective Edge was launched against Gaza in July of 2014 and lasted, so it was from July, the beginning of July to August of 2014. And between that time, less than a month, Israel killed an estimated 2,191 Palestinians, 1,660 of them which were civilians, 527 of them which were children, and 299 women. The Palestinian Ministry of Health documented 11,000 Palestinians had been wounded, including 3,300 children, 2,000 women, 400 elderly people. And you might, like, it's really no mistake that the civilian casualties were so high, as Human Rights Watch documented that they actually went so far as to say that there had been no evidence of any military targets, that the Israeli military was attacking completely indiscriminately, regardless of the high levels of technology that they have, thanks to the United States. Human Rights Watch also, during Operation Protective Edge, recorded that several incidents of Israeli forces shooting and killing fleeing civilians that were fleeing the war, that weren't combatants in any sense. And of these children, I mentioned that 3,374 children had been wounded. Of these, 1,000 children will suffer lifelong disabilities due to their injuries. And what that looks like is not even psychological support. At least 373,000 children required specialized psychosocial support after the war. But 1,000 children will suffer from lifelong physical disabilities. And so what that looks like, amputations and things that Gaza's medical facilities and infrastructure cannot support. So a lot of the lives and the livelihoods of those children and their families were decimated within less than a month. During these attacks, around 108,000 Palestinians became homeless. 485,000 Palestinians were displaced, and that is out of the 1.8 million population. So it's a significant portion of the population was left displaced and homeless. So on this hand, 2,191 Palestinians are murdered. On the other hand, 66 Israeli soldiers died and 4 Israeli civilians. So this can kind of prompt us to ask the question, how much of Israel's actions, military actions, are in self-defense? If truly the proportions of people that were murdered and mutilated are so large on one hand and smaller on the other. Just like a week into this assault, Amnesty International released a statement to the US government asking them to terminate all deliveries of military aircraft fuel to Israel. And they didn't do that. They actually decided to transform 26,000 tons more fuel weeks into the assault. So that is the case that I used to make the claim that Israel has violated the first section of what we know as a gross human rights violation, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment.
I don't know if we're going to move to another topic, but I can't quite stand still. In 2006, I was working in Ramallah, but I was running an office of 15 people in Gaza City. And one day I had a communication with the engineer I was working with, and he explained his absence the prior day. He said, well, the Israelis blew up the apartment house next door to us and killing 22 of my neighbors. And so there were things that he couldn't ignore attending to, but he was back at work the next day. What you're talking about is that 2014, of course, was dreadful, but the one before that was equally, and the one before that's equally dreadful, the one before that's equally dreadful. It's a persistent pattern that's extremely deep, and yeah, I certainly relate to that element. Yeah, thanks for letting me butt in.
Yeah, of course. So the second case that I used to fulfill the definition section, prolonged detention without charges and trial, I think relates a lot to the work that your organization does in regarding to the military court system in Israel. So the military court system existed since the beginning of Israel's military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank after the 1967 war. And so basically, military courts function based on the premise of military law, and they persecute those who violated Israel's military body of law. And so basically, the Israeli military court has jurisdiction over two types of offenses, those of which include security offenses and threats to public order. Common offenses that you'll see in an Israeli military court are entering Israel without a permit, stone throwing, that's actually the most common offense, is stone throwing, membership in an illegal association, violence, firearm-related offenses, and traffic violations. So they were initially put in place these courts were initially put in place for anyone living in the West Bank, including Israeli settlers and foreign nationals. However, in the early 1980s, the Israeli government decided that Israeli settlers and foreign nationals would be brought before Israeli civilian courts, and the military court system was then exclusively reserved for the prosecution of Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. So Palestinians and Israelis are prosecuted in completely different courts under different laws for the exact same offense. So, for example, I could be living in the West Bank, and I'll have a neighbor who's an Israeli settler. If we're both caught throwing stones, for example, at an Israeli soldier, he will be taken into an Israeli civil court, and I would have to go to the Israeli military court. So even regardless of the proximity to each other, the relation of the offense, Palestinians and Israeli settlers in the West Bank are prosecuted under completely different systems. And also, to kind of increase this bias, Israeli soldiers are always military judges and prosecutors, and they're solely responsible for all military orders. Let's see. So in relation to what we were talking about earlier about children in the military court system, according to a report that I used in my thesis, between the years of 2005 to 2010, at least 835 Palestinian minors were arrested and tried in Israeli military courts in the West Bank on the charges of stone throwing alone. And only one of these 835 children were acquitted. That's just, it's a number that you have to sit with. Only one of them was acquitted, and they're all children. Beit Salem, which is an Israeli organization, collected the accounts of 50 minors who described their experiences of arrest and incarceration by Israel, and 30 of the minors said that they were taken and detained in the middle of the night, which is a common strategy of the Israeli military, to really just knock down your doors in the middle of the night to prevent any distress from neighbors or any resistance really from the people around you. And also, of these 30, their parents were not allowed to accompany them. Between that same time period, between 2005 and 2010, 93% of minors convicted with stone throwing were given a prison sentence. And being security prisoners, the minors were not allowed to access a telephone to reach or update their parents or legal representation during the entire duration of their detention. And that's because what a security offense really means is that regardless of the detainee's age or the prisoner's age, even those that are under the age of like 14 years old, don't have the privilege of a reduced sentence, even with the establishment of the juvenile military court. So that's kind of gives you a view of what the Israeli military court produces in regards to sentencing. The rate of, let's see. Sorry. So yeah, that's kind of provides a little bit of a summary. I can expand more on that later if we want to. Shall I go into the third section? It's a little bit shorter.
Yeah, you had a section on disappearance, you had a section on denial of rights, and we have, and just for anybody else who's listening or watching, in about 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes, we're going to switch from this presentation to a question and answer. And as our director asked, peppering people with the chat stuff is not that helpful. But if you could wait until later or to have questions if you have them. So we've got like the last 15 minutes set aside for that. But so Zarefah, we've got like another 10, 12 minutes. So I do think this time we've got two more case studies, the disappearance and the denial of right. And then we'll have a few other things after that and try to use our 60 minutes wisely. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the third case that I used to fulfill the section definition causing the disappearance and clandestine detention of those persons was a particular case of Muhammad al-Halabi, which he worked for a humanitarian organization in the Gaza Strip. He was a husband, a father of 5, and the charity organization that he worked for was U.S. based. It's called World Vision. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in 2006 he became the director of World Vision in the Gaza Strip. And basically, what this organization does is it provides emergency relief services to families in Gaza, community-centered development. And basically, they're a Christian charity that is committed to helping the world's poor all over the world. So basically, World Vision's work had a big impact following Israeli offensives, and such as that of 2008, that left nearly half of Gaza's population under extreme poverty. So in June of 2016, Israeli forces arrested Muhammad at an Israeli checkpoint. And his arrest was a collaboration between Shin Bet, which is the internal security agency of Israel, and the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli police. He was accused of funneling money from World Vision to resistance groups in Gaza, and he was subjected to 52 days of interrogation and torture. His dad talked a little bit about what that torture looked like, and he reported that Israeli intelligence officers placed a filthy bag over his head and hanged him from the ceiling for prolonged periods. They denied him sleep, physically assaulted him, slapping him, kicking him, strangling him. And he reported to his dad that at times he really felt like he was on the brink of death. He was placed into a small room with extremely loud music. And so it would basically give him terrible headaches and ear pain. And during the summer times, they would strip him naked and blast flashes of warm air at him. And then they would do the same process in the winter with cold air. And many that have heard his story and know the details of his story speculate that his imprisonment was an effort to further cut off Gaza and isolate Gaza from international humanitarian organizations and undermine international support of Gaza. According to Human Rights Watch, the Israeli army uses broadly worded military orders to detain and punish Palestinian journalists, activists, etc. And Human Rights Watch also stated that Israel targets charitable organizations which work in the Palestinian territories. They've arrested members of the United Nations, Doctors Without Borders, the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, and other organizations that do similar work that really do keep Gaza afloat during these times. They've also arrested almost 100 journalists between 2017 and 2018, and closed a bunch of different media institutions that were based in the Gaza Strip. And Mohammed, even though the Australian government discredited the charges against him, Mohammed remains in Israeli prison till this day. Yeah, it's a very terrible case. But the subject of prisoners from Gaza is far different than the reality of prisoners that live in the West Bank. When Israel removed their troops from the Gaza Strip in 2005, that changed the status of prisoners from the Gaza Strip permanently. Unless they're attempting to cross the border, the only way they would really be arrested by Israeli forces is during an Israeli ground invasion. So basically, when people are getting arrested, it's during times like Operation Protective Edge, when there are soldiers on the ground detaining people for whatever reason, for really no reason at all. And it's also a lot more difficult for family members in Gaza to receive permits to enter Israel. It can take, if you're a family member in the West Bank applying to cross the border to see your child in an Israeli prison, it would take every 2 weeks you can apply to do that. But for Gazan families, you can apply every 2 months at most. And then also, like during certain times, Israel will suspend family visits for Gazan prisoners completely for confidential security concerns. So the realities of these both prisoners existing in the same prison apparatus are very different because of the different statuses of Gaza and the West Bank in regards to Israel and immigration. But to reiterate this, it is completely against international law for Israel to transfer any prisoners into Israeli prisons in Israel, because it creates this situation where they're isolated from their families, from their legal representation, and the vast majority of prisoners are transferred into Israel. The vast majority. I mean, there's only one prison that exists in the West Bank, one Israeli prison that exists in the West Bank, and all of the other ones exist in Israel. So it completely cuts off all prisoners, regardless. It's just harder for Gazan immigrants or Gazan families to go to Israel than it is for people in the West Bank.
Well, I think in the interest of time, that topic is not mined out, but we have one more case, the flagrant denial, or the right liberty issue, and maybe in a couple minutes after that, we have some conclusions to try to get to. We can.
Okay, great. So should I continue?
Well, yeah, I think you've set out 4 criteria and you've illuminated 3 of them. I think, maybe, because I've seen your write-up on that. It's compelling. So if you could share that with people, I think it'd be really important.
Yeah, of course. So the last section that I included in my master's thesis was the flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of person. And I used the case of Al-Araqib village to illustrate that. So Al-Araqib is a Palestinian Bedouin village that can date back to the 7th century. When Israel was founded in 1948, a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign began against the Bedouin populations of Palestine. And after 1953, about 90% of Palestinians were expelled from Al-Araqib village in the Nakab Desert. Their village and descendants now lie in Israel proper, and their villages remain unrecognized by the Israeli state. So these Bedouins are really considered by Israel as trespassers on state land, even though that's where they've been for centuries. And because they're in this limbo status and they're seen as trespassers, Israel denies them access to water, to electricity, to sewage, and other basic needs. And in June of 2013, this really all kind of came together when the Israeli government voted in favor of something called the Begin Bill, which aimed basically to expel the residents of 35 of these unrecognized Palestinian Bedouin villages that were in Israel proper, and aimed to further expel and cleanse Israel of Palestinians in general. As a result, Israel demolished Araki village over 140 times, and each time the villagers have rebuilt. 140 times they've rebuilt their village. But the reality of Araki is really, it's not unique whatsoever. In Palestine, home demolitions by the Israeli government are very frequent. According to the UN, Israel demolished over 1,100 structures in occupied East Jerusalem over the past decade. And the UN Commission on Human Rights reported that the occupying powers' confiscation of land and properties belonging privately and collectively to the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory is a dominant feature of the occupation. These practices by the Israeli government, alongside the Israeli military, violate long-established international law principles of the unacceptability of the acquisition of territory by force, as well as specific resolutions against Israel and their confiscation of land and settlement activity. So since in 2019, according to Beit Salem, that Israeli organization that I mentioned before, Israel demolished at least 140 homes in East Jerusalem, Palestinian homes, making 238 Palestinians homeless, including 127 minors. So this is a very significant, kind of motif that shows you how Israel feels towards its responsibilities in international law towards occupied people that they are occupying.
Well, I think you have the rigor to go on, but so it seems like you've made a pretty compelling case that if there are these 4 criteria that seem to have been met, it looks like a case could be made for some determination of noncompliance. But are there other nations who are also out of compliance? Or if you look at 2 screens, major recipients of U.S. funds, which you think should be the ability to have increased influence over somebody who's self-funded. But are there others whose behavior is more or less comparable? Do you see some basis for, is Israel in a unique spot or a rare spot or common spot in terms of that? You dealt with it a little earlier, but you've made quite clear the intensity and magnitude of what appear to be violations.
So that's a really good point. Like I mentioned in the very beginning, the amount of military security force units that are, their aid is revoked from the Department of State, that amount is minuscule. So I think the reason why Israel is a case that needs to be focused on in this regard is because Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since the Second World War. And so the standard that we have, we should hold them to a higher standard. And this is by fault of the vetting system, by bias, and like Human Rights Watch said, the Department of State will outright violate the law if it's strategic to do so. But I think that this also then sends a message to other countries that we provide aid to, whether that be Saudi Arabia or India or whoever, and it shows us that, it will show them, the recipients of this aid, that we're not going to hold you accountable because we don't hold our largest recipient of aid accountable. So yeah, they've definitely set a standard in regards to foreign military financing.
Okay, I think that, in 40 minutes or less, I think you've brought us around to a point where we could say, I certainly, and perhaps most of our viewers, would see that what the status quo is not healthy or the right thing to be doing. You've had some legislative liaison work. You've done a handful of things. What are a couple of things that, as we get to the point of saying what is to be done? Wringing our well-washed hands, I suppose, but some constructive things. What a couple of things that come to mind, and I expect we'll have viewers with related questions. But what are a couple of starting thoughts on things we might be doing?
I have kind of two perspectives on this. I think that there's a lot that we can do in regards to lobbying our congressmen and women. We need to expose them to Palestine rights-based legislation because it is being produced. It's new, but it's being produced, such as Betty McCollum's HR 2407 and her HR 8050. These need to be, our Congress people need to know that this is our agenda. These are our interests that they need to defend in Congress. And if there is an investigation that's launched, they also need to be in support of that investigation, or don't vote for them again in the next term. So I think that that's a way that we can approach this situation, but also educating ourselves and educating our communities about these issues, and getting involved as a consumer. For example, I think I'm a strong proponent of the BDS movement. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which basically sets out a list of criteria for Israel to follow, and we're going to boycott all of their products if they don't, basically. So I think that those are two really important ways that we can get involved as a community, but also from a legislative perspective.
Excellent. So things we can do as individuals, things we can do as groups we choose to associate with, and things for our government. So I think at this point, I'd like to switch us back to our director, Jennifer, and I think she probably has a question or comment or two that has drifted in.
Yes, thank you, Gary, and thank you, Zarefah, so much for speaking to us today. We really appreciate it. It's a lot of great knowledge and a very important topic. So I'd like to turn it to our viewers. If you have questions, we do not have the ability to have audio on, but if you'd like to ask any questions through YouTube or through Facebook, go ahead and please put those in the chat and we will read them out for you. Also, if you do not feel comfortable asking a question online in front of everyone, you can always refer to our website, which is at the bottom of the page in the banner. CFJ-Colorado.org is our website, and our email is cfjcolorado@gmail.com, and you can also write us to our PO box. We'd be happy to add you to our list and to get you any more information. So we had a question on getting Zarefah's thesis out there, so we sent the link. And right now I'm not seeing other questions, but let's give viewers a moment to go ahead and chat those in there.
Well, if there's a quiet moment, Zarefah, things that we could have talked about, things that you'd like people to, that maybe out of format or structure or anything we've gotten into in the last half hour, but other things that add to the importance of this work, or way to get into it. Anything you've been itching to say?
I think that in regards to the conversation we were having about what can be done, from my experience lobbying for HR 2407, there's a lot of important legislation out there that our Congress people aren't being exposed to. it's really surprising that I'll go to them and they'll even have signed something or declined something, but if I ask them about it, they wouldn't really be able to tell me what the bill says, or what this would mean for Palestinians or Palestinian prisoners or Palestinian children. And so educating them, even though it's unfortunate that we have to do that, it's a necessary step that we need to take. For example, my own congresswoman, I approached her about HR 2407, which is a bill which basically condemns the Israeli military court system and argues that the United States should revoke funding under the premise of the Israeli military court system trying children. And none of my representatives were familiar with it. And so I think it's important to show them that exists and that's what we want as their constituents.
I think that makes.
If I could interrupt you, Gary, we had a question that came in from the audience. So how does Zarefah see the changing balance of forces in the Middle East affecting the Palestinian struggle for its national rights?
Let's see.
And Gary, you can
Yeah, Gary, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think the questioner is saying in the last few months, we have seen the Trump administration arrange a bunch of normalization efforts, first with the Emirates, then Bahrain, and then Morocco and Sudan, and more to come. And these are miscast as peace arrangements. And, our outgoing president positioning himself as a Nobel Peace Prize recipient because he's arranged. Well, there's never been a state of war between Bahrain and Israel, and they've been doing business with each other for decades under the cover. So the problem is, up till now, the Gulf states, the oil wealthy states, have maintained the posture that a peace with Palestine, between Palestine and Israel, is essential to their foreign policy. Well, this veneer has been peeled off, and it shows that this new partition, it's out in the open that the Gulf Arabs see Shia Iran as the great opponent, as do the Israelis. So I guess the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So there's a lot of commonality between Israel now and the Gulf states. And in each case, our president has given the people who are participating something they didn't have. And Morocco took Spanish Sahara a couple of decades ago, and it's been illegal occupation. Everybody, the whole world sees it that way. But our president says, well, it's yours, take it. Sort of like the Golan Heights is Israel's, take it. So in each case, our president administration has given one of these Gulf or Arab states something he didn't have to give, but it's put a veil of legitimacy on it. So in all cases, the Palestinian issue has gone from a purported priority to a non-priority. So, my sense is it's intensely negative. The normalization of the abnormal is something that any of us who have been involved in the Palestinian rights struggle are very much opposed to. If it's not normal, don't treat it normal. There's many Palestinian organizations I've been close to, or people have been close to, refuse to accept.
Gary, we have another question. Will prosecute them, and are these international laws that they have broken? And for either one of you, Zarefah or Gary.
Which international law is broken? What?
The question is, since Israel is breaking these laws, our laws here in the United States, who will prosecute them? And they are wondering if these are also international laws that are being broken. Zarefah, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Sure, I can answer that question. The majority of the aid that Israel receives is something called foreign military financing, and a lot of that can't be tracked. And so in regards to the Leahy laws, prosecution might be difficult in the case of Israel, but there is currently an international investigation at the International Criminal Court happening So we need to stay updated about that for sure. I don't know what the latest news is with that, but I think that it will most likely change given the new administration. For the better or for the worse, I'm not sure, but I know that the dynamics will change.
Okay, thank you, Zarefah. Here's an interesting question. What reception did you have to your thesis among your colleagues, students, and professors?
Amongst my professors, I had a really great advisor. She was very supportive and helped me a lot with the reception that I received from my fellow students. Unfortunately, there was some backlash from the students in my cohort, and many of them weren't really able to kind of defend me because they weren't really familiar with the topic either. So it was definitely an interesting period of my life. Because I had to defend my thesis, but really against a lot of people who identified as Zionists. And so it was definitely interesting. But I got really great feedback from my professors and really great support.
Okay, thank you. Another question, are these 4 categories, the ones that you discussed, are they editable for future Israeli incursions that would further strengthen the argument to hold Israel accountable to the Leahy laws?
Absolutely. So HR 2407, which is that bill that I mentioned by Betty McCollum, basically wants to amend the Leahy laws to add the use of military courts into the definition of a gross human rights violation. So that would become a restriction of countries receiving aid. So yes, they are editable.
Okay, and a question, how can we hear about bills like HR 2407 as they're getting drafted? Of course, going to the U.S. House of Representatives, looking at their website, any other mechanisms you would advise, Zarefah?
So I personally work for an organization called American Muslims for Palestine, and that's a lot of the work that we do is education campaigns revolving around these different pieces of legislation. So if you type in ampalestine.com or .org, sorry, we often update our social media about these bills as they're coming out, and so you can use that as a resource. There's a lot of resources on the website about these particular pieces of legislation and even lobbying materials for how to present these to your members of Congress.
We just had a comment. The Foundation for Middle East Peace, FMEP, has a weekly report on all legislation related to Israel-Palestine. Thank you.
That's great.
Okay, are there any other questions?
I saw a comment about with the bills that I mentioned. So there was HR 2407 and then HR 8050, which is the Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which was drafted by Representative Betty McCollum.
Okay.
Well, if there's a moment of silence, I did want to mention, as a referee, you talked about contacting representatives and frequently having them be total unaware. I think it's an easy thing when we're accustomed to hostility or rigid barriers to some conversations. When a party is silent or absent on a topic, I find it myself going to the assumption that they're hostile and opposed to it. And what you're saying is they're unaware of it. And this is an encouraging thought that somebody who's not visibly taken a supportive role is not necessarily an opponent. So I take that as encouragement.
Absolutely. And a lot of these Democratic representatives, for example, that will sign on to legislation against police brutality, for example, it's really easy. It's an easy avenue because you can say, if you're against the militarization of local police forces, then likely you would be against the the militarization of the Israeli Defense Forces that are doing similar damage in both places. So a lot of these people, it's if you say it the right way, you can maybe get them on your side, and it's been successful in a lot of cases.
Okay, probably one more question, Zarefah. The question is, do you think that Betty McCollum will reintroduce the bill this year? And do you think it'll go anywhere? The 2407.
I'm really not sure. I know that the second time it was introduced, it got a lot of support. I'm not sure about the next term, but I hope so.
Okay, well, it is now 8 o'clock Mountain Time, so we'll have to wrap up. CFJ Colorado really wants to thank you, Zarefah, again for your time and all of your research and the passion that you bring to this subject. And Gary Anderson, thank you so much for being our interviewer tonight. If anyone would like to send this out to their friends, this interview will be saved on Facebook and YouTube, and so you'll be able to collect it and watch it again and send it out to your friends as well. And just keep in mind that we will continue to be doing interviews as part of CFJ, and so we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening.